it's a pleasure to be here. And so I'm going to discuss quantum spin liquids, indeed, from an experimentalist point of view. You probably all know, good specialists here, that Kagome lattice is the most suitable spin lattice to look for quantum spin liquids, at least for a simple, very simple Heisenberg-Hamiltonian with nearest neighbor antiferromagnetic interactions. So here today I want to discuss two cases which are slightly beyond this archetypal Kagome lattice that is depicted here. That's this corner sharing triangle lattice. So two cases which are slightly different. The first one is so-called breathing Kagome lattice that is realized in this vanadate material. So here the Kagome lattice is it's not a true Kagome in the sense that there are two kinds of triangle, upward and downward triangles with weak bound and stronger bounds. So it's somehow a generalization of the Kagome lattice because it encompasses the Kagome lattice. And the second case I'll discuss is a generalization of the Kagome lattice to 3 dimensions in this so-called hyper-Kagome lattice that is realized in this copper oxide here. And so it's this network that I will describe a bit further, but it's made of corner sharing triangles as the Kagome lattice, but in a 3-dimensional arrangement. And these two materials are also quantum spin liquid candidates. Okay, so before that, I will introduce quantum spin liquids and frustration, again from an experimentalist perspective. Maybe I can be a bit brief, but okay, still it's interesting. I will try to stress the experimental signature of this elusive ground state, which are not always so clear-cut. Okay, so first let me thank my collaborators. First, all the group, the group of spectroscopies of quantum materials, which is my group at the Laboratoire de Physique des Solides. And in particular, Philippe Mendels. Some of you may have heard him 2 weeks before. He gave a talk here about standard Kagome lattice material, which is Herbert Smithite. And Edwin Kermarek, who is here in the audience. I would like to thank particularly Quentin Barthélémy and Brendan Le Pennec, who are more involved with Edwin, myself, and Philippe on the quantum spin liquid topic. So the two materials I'm going to discuss are collaborative work. The vanadate material was the main topic of the thesis of Jean-Christophe Aurin, who is now at Paul Scherrer Institute. And this was a collaboration with our group and the St. Andrews and the Edinburgh group. The samples were made in St. Andrews in particular. And at that time, Lucy Clark was doing a PhD in this group. So it was a joint collaboration, and she's now at a permanent position in Liverpool. And we also worked with Bernard Bernu in Paris to model the susceptibility in this material. We'll describe his result a bit later. And the second material, the copper oxide material, the hyper Kagome, was made at different places actually in the world, but by this guy, Koteswara Bomiseti, who used to be a student in the group some times ago, and it's been studied also by Penchanan Kuntia, who was a postdoc 2 years ago. And they are now both back in India at permanent position in Madras and Tirupati. Okay, so let me start with an introduction to quantum spin liquids. we are going to discuss insulator material with localized moments, which are well described by simple Heisenberg Hamiltonian with antiferromagnetic interaction. And for bipartite lattices, we expect a transition to long-range order at low temperature, below NL temperature, with some magnetic Bragg peaks in diffraction experiment, with specific spin wave excitation that you can measure the dispersion in inelastic neutron scattering, for instance. And maybe you are a bit less familiar with μSR, which is a technique which I will discuss a little bit later. Here in μSR, it's a resonant technique that is quite similar to NMR, but the idea is to use the spin of implanted muons in the material instead of the spin of the nuclei as in NMR. But so at large-scale facilities in England, for instance, or at Paul Scherrer Institute in Switzerland, polarized, there are 100% polarized beam of muons are produced, and they stop in the sample, for instance in this cuprate there. And if you are below the Néel temperature, if there is some static internal field, the muon spin will start to precess around these local fields, which are static, and give this very specific oscillation. And the frequency of this oscillation is directly proportional to the static local field inside the sample. So it's a direct local measurement of any possible internal field in your sample, and it's very accurate to detect a very small internal field. Okay, so if we want to go beyond this paradigm, we all know this seminal paper by Anderson, who proposed that at least in dimension higher than 1, on top of the strongest quantum fluctuation that you can imagine for spin 1/2, you need to have another ingredient, which is frustration of the magnetic interaction. In particular, it can be geometric frustration if you are on a triangular lattice. And with these two ingredients, possibly you can destabilize enough Néel order to have something different as a ground state. So what kind of ground state can you imagine? We can imagine now that quantum fluctuations are strong enough so that the building block for the ground state is this pairing of the spins into singlets, and you can build up ground state from this block. So we can imagine a long-range order of this singlet states, of these dimers, like to create some kind of valence bond crystal. And Anderson was pushing a bit further the idea by making a superposition of all the dimer configuration that you can imagine to lower still the energy of a ground state. So that's the resonating valence bond state that he proposed as one kind of possible spin liquid. So this I use this example to give one possible definition of quantum spin liquid, namely a state that without any spontaneous symmetry breaking. So this is one particular definition. You could ask Grégoire to tell you more about the possible definition of spin liquids. But I will stick to this one, which in particular exclude all possible long-range order and this kind of order also. So long-range order of dimers are excluded from this definition because they break translational order. Okay, so now above the ground state, the excitation of these quantum spin liquids are likely very exotic, and we can take the example of quantum spin liquid in dimension 1, which is better characterized. There, so that's the case of a spin 1/2 chain, a simple spin spin 1/2 chain with antiferromagnetic interaction. And there it's known that the excitation are not magnons with spin 1, but fractional excitation with spin 1/2, which are called spinons. And in elastic neutron scattering experiment, they give this very specific continuum of spin-on excitation, which is very different from the branch of spin wave that I was showing before for Néel ground state. So the spin-on here, they can be in elastic neutron scattering. So you create one excitation by reversing one spin, and this spin you can separate it into two excitations, which are not related. We can move freely on the chain, which are two domain walls, which can move freely and which are eventually independent particles of spin 1/2. So in 2D, the situation is maybe a bit less clear, but we can imagine the same kind of excitation with probably richer physics. So here also, if we break one dimer, it will give two spin 1/2 excitation, and there are no reason why they should stay close to each other. There's no binding energy. Moving one of these excitation just demands to reorganize locally the dimers, and so this spin 1/2 should live independently. So we could have something equivalent to the spin 1/2 spinon in 1D. So these excitation are very intriguing, and that's one way to try to understand the kind of different spin liquid that may be realized. So the structure of the excitation spectrum can be gapped. For instance, that would be the case of the state proposed by Anderson, for instance, with a finite correlation length, sorry, with so a gap in all the thermodynamic quantities. But you can imagine also different scenarios which are quite discussed these days in the literature. For instance, you could have this fermionic excitation. They could make up some kind of Fermi surface, which can be very simple, like free electrons in the metal, and give some signatures like linear specific heat, for instance, or Coringa-Low in NMR. Or the structure can be a bit more complex, the dispersion, with, for instance, Dirac cone in the dispersion, which is the case that seems to be favored for the Kagome lattice these days. And there we would expect some power law behavior of the measurable quantities. Okay, so now back to materials. Where should we look for this exotic ground state and exotic excitation? Well, so following the idea of understand, you want a material with low spin, with a geometrical frustration, so with a triangular lattice. But this is not enough. That's been known for a while now, that even spin 1/2 on the triangular lattice, even in this case, the ground state is Néel ordered. So we have to go one step further, and the next step is to lower the coordination of the network, so to deplete the triangular lattice, to remove some nodes, and to go from the coordinates 6 of the triangular lattice to a coordinates 4 of the so-called Kagome lattice, where the triangles are only corner shared and not edge sharing. So we can try to understand a bit why Kagome lattice is better than triangular lattice. I give two very simple arguments, maybe a bit naive. One is energetical. So I give here for several lattices, spin chain, square lattice, triangular lattice, and Kagome lattice. I give the energy per site for Néel state. So this energy in the Néel state depends on the coordination of the lattice. The stronger the coordination, the more stable is the Néel state. And on the cross product, the scalar product of the spin, which is less favorable if you have frustration. And on the right, that's the energetics for dimer coverage, dimer state, which is always the same because whatever the lattice, every spin belongs to one dimer. So from this very simple argument, you see that it's only in 2D, it's only in the Kagome case that it's clearly, the dimer state is clearly energetically favorable. It doesn't mean that this state has to be realized. There can be much more complicated situation like order by disorder mechanism and so on and so on. But at least that underlines the specificity of the Kagome lattice. So with this argument, I just go back a little. You see that that's, I think, my rationalization, my understanding why there is so few examples of spin liquid in 3 dimensions is because when you increase the dimension, usually you increase the coordinates of the lattice, and it gets more and more difficult to stabilize something else than Néel state, basically. Because the coordinates usually increases, except in some cases like the hyper-Kagome, which I will discuss. Back there. And the second argument to show the specificity of the Kagome lattice, you've probably seen that very often, is the fact that on the Kagome lattice, even at the classical level, there is a macroscopic degeneracy of the classical ground state that does not exist on the triangular lattice. Something very specific. So now I think it's quite clear, it's quite admitted in the community that on the Heisenberg model, on the Kagome lattice, does have some kind of spin liquid as a ground state. Now, which kind of spin liquid is still very much debated. And these days, it seems that from DMRG and advanced numerics, it seems that it could be this kind of state with rather long correlation lengths and maybe possibly of Dirac U1 Dirac type with Dirac cones in the dispersion for the spin-ons. But okay, still this kind of states which are gapped, like the gapped Z2 spin liquid, which is like the proposal by Anderson, is still very much discussed also. And the interesting point is that if this state is realized, all the prediction gives values for the gap of the order of J over 10, J over 20, depending on the singlet sector or magnetic sector, but something which is small, reduced compared to J, but not that small for the experience, because if you think of, for instance, Herbert-Smithite, which has a J of about 200 Kelvin, J over 20 is still very accessible in the experiment, and in principle that should be easy to distinguish these two cases. The gap that is predicted here is not very small in real case. Okay, so if we go to materials, some of you may have seen this slide before. These are candidates for the Heisenberg model on the Kagome lattice, and quite strikingly, they are all fairly similar materials. They are all minerals made of copper 2+, with quite similar chemistry. So these days, Herbert-Smithite is still the archetypal candidate. Barlow-White is quite discussed these days, but it's not so much different from Herbert-Smithite, I would say, from at first sight. So what is the state of the art? Well, I'm not going to start Philippe Mendel's talk again, but basically Herbert-Smithite remains the closest realization to the Heisenberg model on the Kagome lattice. And the reason for that is it's the only clear case where we are sure that the first term in the Hamiltonian is really Heisenberg on the true Kagome lattice. And then there are certainly perturbations. There is Jaroszewski-Moria. There is certainly maybe second order nearest neighbor interaction, whatever. But there are typically 10% below. There are really perturbations to this first order model, basically. So that's what makes it very special. Now,
sorry,
yeah.
Can you go back 1 second to the
Yeah.
So you said the new one, the Barlow-White.
Yeah.
So it has undistorted Kagome
Yeah,
plates also?
also, yeah. It's quite similar to Herbert-Smithite, actually. It has nearly the same formula, but there is fluorine and bromide instead of chlorine in Herbert-Smithite. So you have very similar Kagome planes. The stacking is a bit different. In Herbert-Smithite, the Kagome planes are not in front of each other, basically. They are shifted. That's not the case in Barlow-White. There's a bit more space for the interlayer side, so people were saying that you could put some larger non-magnetic ions like cadmium or things like that, something different from zinc, but it turned out that you can substitute it with zinc and not with other things, apparently. Okay. It's a bit more recent, so people are still trying. And
the magnetic properties look similar at first sight?
yeah, well, it's okay. It's starting, basically. But there's a Chinese paper showing that there may be a gap and that this gap would close like you expect for spin 1/2 excitations, but okay, I think it's controversial and we have different results. Okay, that would be a topic for a next seminar, maybe in 1 year or something, when the situation is a bit clearer. Oops, sorry. So unfortunately, on the experimental side, so the issue of gap or no gap in Herbert-Smithite is still not settled, mainly because of the existence of zinc and copper disorder. So certainly this needs more refined analysis with single crystal and so on, and that is really something we are doing. We are not the only one in the world, and also what you want to do is to work on the synthesis at the synthesis level to try to master these defects and to reduce their number or control their number and so on and so on. So that's hard work that has been described by Philippe, and that is ongoing. And the other approach, which I'm going to discuss today, is okay, let's try to go for something different and if possible to some samples with different chemistry so that we don't have the same Jaroszewski-Moria term, the same distortion, the same Jahn-Teller as for copper and so on. So the idea is to try to go for something different and also something maybe different from the Kagome lattice, so to approach the Kagome problem but from another point of view. So that's this track that I'm going to discuss now. So my first example is this vanadate material. So it's got an awful formula. It's an organometallic material where vanadium is the magnetic ion, and you've got a big organic molecule here. So its short name is DQ-VOF. VOF is for vanadium oxyfluoride, and DQ is for the organic molecules, diammonium and quinacridinium. But anyway, so the structure of the compound is at first sight a bit complicated. It's made of layers of, so the magnetic layers are these ones in blue, dark and light blue, which are made of two kinds of vanadium: vanadium 4+, which is a spin 1/2 with just one electron in the d orbitals, and vanadium 3+, which is spin 1. And these magnetic layers, they are well separated from each other by these large organic molecules here, which ensures that the magnetism is very strongly 2D in the material. So if we look at one of these tri-layer in isolation, so first, yes, it's one. Here it's the top view of one vanadium 4+ layer here. You see that the vanadium in light blue, they form the Kagome lattice here. And this Kagome layer here and here, they are binded together by a triangular lattice of vanadium 3+. So here's a side view of so one Kagome layer, one triangular layer of spin 1, and again one Kagome lattice of spin 1/2. Okay? And so that's the interesting block for the magnetic properties. So it looks awfully complicated. And so if we try to build a very first order magnetic model, we need at least 3 interactions. So in the Kagome plane, so the Kagome is not a real Kagome lattice actually, because you see there are two kinds of triangles. Either there is one vanadium 3+ on top, or there is not. So the two triangles are inequivalent. That's what makes the breathing actually of the Kagome lattice. So you expect naively two different interactions, J1 and J2, in the Kagome plane. And then on top of that, you can have, well, you certainly have an interaction between vanadium 4+ and the vanadium 3+ on top, which is a transverse interaction, which is called J3. Okay? So, fortunately, nature is good with us. Because if we look at the chemistry, the vanadium 4+ sits in an octahedron, which is strongly distorted. This octahedron is made of 5 fluorine ions in green, so F-, and 1 O2- at the bottom. And this O2- is closer to the vanadium 4+ than all the other bonds. So this strong distortion favors, well, lifts the degeneracy of the T2G orbitals, and they make this orbital very much favorable, this DXY. And since there is just one electron, that's the magnetically active orbital, here, and the only one. So everything happens in the Kagome plane because of this DXY orbital, and you may expect that the transverse coupling will be very small, because there will be no overlap of this DXY orbital with vertical orbitals of the fluorine that should bridge vanadium 3+ and vanadium 4+ in the transverse. So naively, well, not so much naively, but from quantum chemistry argument, you may expect that J3 is actually very small, or much smaller than the interaction that you will have in the Kagome plane due to the overlap of the DXY orbitals. And in the Kagome plane, so I say that there are two kinds of interaction, depending on whether there is a vanadium 3+ on top of the triangle or not. Actually, the fact that there is a vanadium 3+ that changes a bit the distances between the vanadium ion, and that changes also, which is more important, likely, that changes the angle of the super-exchange. So that changes quite strongly the value of the interaction, certainly. So you can have very naive arguments from quantum chemistry, but you expect that basically J is related to the cosine square of the angle, so you may expect that the ratio is of the order of 0.6. Given that we know the average value from the Curie-Weiss behavior at high temperature, you may expect values like that for J1 and J2. This has been somewhat confirmed by DFT calculation, which are unfortunately unpublished by Oleg Johnson, who found, well, most interestingly, he found that with DFT, he confirmed that J3 is actually very small, and he gives a ratio for J1 over J2 of the order of 0.7. But it's quite complicated because you saw the structure is very complicated. You have hydrogen, light element, you don't know exactly their position, so DFT is not so easy actually, because you don't know so clearly the structure, and it's a big unit cell. So maybe that's why it was not published. But anyway, so it seems that indeed there are these two kinds of interaction, and J3 is there, but smaller than these two guys.
Are the 4+ ions coupled with each other?
Yeah, through, not directly, through the fluorine. So the J1 and J2 coupling is from one vanadium 4+. You mean the
yes,
from one no?
Okay. No, I think you're sorry.
Okay. So, and so the important point, which I did not maybe stressed enough, is that still the two triangles, they are inequivalent, but they are both they both have threefold symmetry. They are perfect triangles, well, equilateral triangles, which is the important point.
In fact, I was asking the coupling between the spin one.
They are not directly. No, they are too far from each other. The spacing, so there's a coupling. It goes through the Kagome plane, basically. There's no obvious super exchange path. Well, certainly no direct, but no obvious super exchange path. I don't remember if it was computed. I think it was too small to be computed. They are quite far from each other. Okay, so the magnetic model for the Kagome planes in isolation is like this. So these two kinds of triangles with weaker and stronger interaction. So actually this model was worked before, including by Mike, so some time ago, in the years 2000, when people got really excited by the Kagome model, I think, and the idea there was to approach the Kagome problem through weak coupling limit. So starting from isolated triangles and then building up some interaction between these isolated triangles. And so it was worked quite a lot, especially to try, I think that was the aim of Frederick, to try to understand the proliferation of singlet state at low energy in the Kagome model. But it was worked out mainly, uniquely, in the so-called strongly trimerized limit. At this time, this lattice was called trimerized. Now people call it breathing, but it's the same. So it was worked out only in the strongly trimerized limit with weak coupling between the triangles. Okay. So Mike didn't shout so far. He may comment what was the idea behind, but I think that was the main result. I think the idea was that the main belief was that at least in this limit you got something with a gap, a spin liquid with a gap, but the value of the gap was not computed at that time. Okay, and then I don't know any other paper on this special lattice since then. The theoretical interest got lost somehow. So let's go back to the material. Well, there are others, which I will discuss, which are much more recent now, but I will discuss them a bit later. But let's say there was a gap in time between 2005 and 2017, 16. So this is the susceptibility of the material, which shows so the anti-ferromagnetic Curie Weiss behavior at high temperature, and you see this upturn at low temperature here, so it's 1/key here, so susceptibility is shooting up at low temperature, and this is actually the effect of the vanadium 3+. Since they are more or less free, the coupling J3 is small, they follow more or less Curie law, C/T, which diverges. So there, and on the already here, there's no sign of transition at this at theta around J, which is a good sign for strong frustration, and we obviously try to push that to lower temperature by using our favorite tool, which is MuSR, which is a very sensitive tool to prove the absence of static order of static magnetism in a material. So here's the relaxation that we measure. So we implant the muon and we measure how the polarization get lost as a function of the time spent by the muon in the sample. And here's so what we get at 40 Kelvin in the paramagnetic limit, and in black at 40 millikelvin. So you see that there's not much difference. Actually, most of the relaxation comes from the nuclei, because you have a lot of fluorine in the sample. Fluorine has a strong nuclear moment, and the nuclear moments are static at the time scale of MuSR. So they give some small but existing internal field, and that's why already at 40 Kelvin you've got quite a strong relaxation. It's not at all the same. It's not at all the same scale, time scale that I showed for the cuprate, for instance. There in the cuprate, the oscillation were within a few tenths of a few 0.1, 0.2 microseconds. Here, the relaxation is low. So basically, by looking at that, it's for sure that there is no spin freezing in the material. There is no oscillation like I showed in the cuprate material, for instance. So there is no static internal field in the material down to 40 milli-K. And yes, there is this specific form which is due to the complex that is made by muon and fluorine. But that's detail of NMR. If we want to go a bit further, we can get rid of the nuclear relaxation and just look at the electronic relaxation, the relaxation that is due to the vanadium ions, the spin of the vanadium ions. And for that, you apply a small field stronger than the nuclear internal field, and you get this exponential behavior here. So at 40 Kelvin and 40 millikelvin that you can fit with a simple exponent, and you get the relaxation rate here. So that shows that there is a slowing down of the fluctuation below around 10K, and then a saturation of this fluctuation at low temperature. Now you cannot conclude much from that, because the muons stop in the material at different positions close to the fluorine, and they will probe both the vanadium 4+ and vanadium 3+. The vanadium 3+, they are more or less free. They will fluctuate at their own rate, and certainly you're mixing up both kind of response in the MuSR data. So from this, you cannot conclude that there is no gap, for instance, in the Kagome excitation, because you still see some magnetism fluctuating, because it could just be the vanadium 3+. It may be that the vanadium 4+ are gapped, but still you have fluctuation from the vanadium 3+. So it's hard to go much beyond the conclusion that there is no freezing from that. So there is no kind of long-range order or spin glass order down to a very low temperature compared to J. So what we did is to probe the excitation with heat capacity. So heat capacity is still quite complex because you have many contributions. So you have, as usual, contribution from the phonons. You have here in this material, you have a lot of hydrogen and fluorine, so you have a nuclear contribution, which gives Schottky anomalies. You have contribution from the vanadium 3+. If they are really free spins, they should give some kind of electronic Schottky anomaly. And you have the Kagome vanadium 4+ contribution, which is the one that you would like to measure. So how to disentangle that? We played actually with the effect of a magnetic field. So phonon are field independent. The Schottky, we know how they evolve with applied field. And Kagome, we don't know. We don't know much. So we made the simplistic assumption that the heat capacity from the Kagome was not varying with field, that it was field independent. That's the best we could try. So assuming that it was field independent, we tried to fit everything that was field dependent, all the heat capacity that is field dependent, we tried to fit it with only Schottky terms. Okay, so that's what I show here. And actually it works quite well. So with this, now we can subtract these Schottky terms, so all the part that depends on the field. And we are left with that, which should be the field-independent heat capacity, so which may include phonon contribution and contribution from the Kagome lattice of the vanadium 4+. The phonon contribution, we know more or less what it is. It's T to the 3 low, that is very small at low temperature and negligible below 5K, certainly, on this scale. So probably we can forget about it at least below 5K. And so the rest, in this assumption that the Kagome contribution is field independent, the rest is given by this evolution. So the Kagome heat capacity versus temperature is given here. You see, it's quite linear. Certainly, there is no gap, at least down to the lowest point here, which is 0.3 Kelvin. So if there's a gap, it's very small, it's tiny. It's smaller than J over 200. So that's the full excitation spectrum, so including magnetic and non-magnetic excitation here. And quite strikingly, this heat capacity is very much linear with temperature. So that's also something that is fine in Herbert Smithite, maybe with a small power law, but with an exponent close to 1. So it seems one naive understanding of that is that we have fermionic excitation, this spinon. If they are not interacting too much, then you may have indeed some kind of fermionic heat capacity in this insulator, just like in a metal. Okay, so to go a bit further, we looked at the properties from a local viewpoint using NMR. So we started actually using fluorine NMR because fluorine is a very nice sample for NMR. But you see that there are many different sites. Some of them are better coupled to the vanadium 4+, some of them better to the vanadium 3+. So it's a bit of a mess in the end, and it's not so obvious to work out which is which. So in the end, we decided to enrich the material in oxygen-17, and they managed to do that at St. Andrews. And we worked on oxygen. Oxygen is much better because there is just one single site of oxygen in the material, and it's bridged dominantly to only one vanadium, the vanadium 4+ in the structure. So oxygen 17 is a nuclear spin 5-half, and here's the spectrum you obtain for a powder sample, so polycrystalline sample with all direction with respect to the applied field, and we get a very nice spectrum, which is a textbook example for spin 5-half NMR. So that's very nice because that shows that there is indeed, as expected, one single site. So there is no large dilution of vanadium 4+ Kagome lattice, for instance, or no large distortion there. If you imagine that there would be a vacancy at some position, then you would have one oxygen with no magnetic shift. So you would expect one line, a second line, at the reference there, for instance, and you should see it if it's more than a few percent, for instance. So it should be easy to see. So the Kagome plane itself looks quite homogeneous and quite nice.
You don't see some broadening with temperature?
Yeah, it does broaden a lot. Yeah, you will see. It broadens a lot because of the vanadium 3+ there, which is still there, and it gives a dipolar field that you still probe here at the oxygen site. But dipolar field is not very, well, it's a problem because it broadens your line, so you lose accuracy, but a dipolar is a traceless interaction. So on a powder average, there is no shift of your line because of dipolar. So it goes to some broadening of the line, but it doesn't give any shift. So here's how it looks. So at high temperature, at high temperature you've got this narrow line that I was showing, and then you see that it shifts quite a lot, actually, of the order of tenths of 0.5%. And so it starts going away from the reference down to about 50 Kelvin, and then it goes back to the reference again. So in terms of, if you plot the shift of the line versus temperature, it goes like that through a maximum at around J/2. So this is the local susceptibility that is non-monotonic and which at variance with the SQUID, the macroscopic susceptibility I was showing. The macroscopic susceptibility shoots up at low temperature because of the vanadium 3+. Here you see the vanadium 4+ in isolation, so only the Kagome susceptibility. So somehow you have suppressed the vanadium 3+ contribution. So here's what is that's the same with the logarithmic scale for the temperature to show better the low temperature. So there are huge error bars which are due to this broadening that you have there, but it seems that the susceptibility goes more or less to some either to 0 or to some finite value that is quite small in any case. So something close to 0. Here on the same scale, that was the macroscopic susceptibility here, which was monotonically increasing at low temperature. So with the help of Bernard, we tried to understand a bit further this susceptibility. Bernard Bernu has developed, has improved the high temperature series technique by actually using, instead of high temperature expansion of the free energy, he uses an approximation of entropy versus energy, which is better behaved with boundaries at low energy, high energy, which are known. It's also monotonic. So this allows him to compute the susceptibility on the whole temperature range, from high temperature to low temperature. And what he needs is a model for the very low temperature heat capacity. So this is this alpha here. So we tried different models, power law of temperature, with alpha equal 0 to mimic spin gap, for instance, or linear term, alpha equal 1, or quadratic. And in any case, you can more or less fit the data, because also there are huge error bars. So certainly from the shift data, we cannot say anything on the presence or absence of a gap in the model by fitting that. You can get a good agreement for all models. But fairly interestingly, in any case, you get values for the ratio of J1 over J2, which is the free parameter in this expansion. You get values which are always very similar and close to 0.5, 0.6. So quite in agreement with the simplistic argument I was giving at the beginning. Okay. So to get an idea on this issue of gap or no gap, we also measured T1 spin lattice relaxation, which is directly probing the excitation spectrum. It's probing the fluctuation of the local field, so really the excitation spectrum. And you see that this here it's 1 over T1 that is represented versus temperature, and over 2 decades in temperature, the variation is actually very moderate. And certainly there is no large gap here, because you would expect a change of T1 by orders of magnitude. So we tried to fit this T1. So we tried to enforce a gap. So it's a phenomenological fit with power law to represent this very moderate change of 1 over T1 with a small alpha of 0.3, 0.4. And if you want to force a gap, in particular to get this last point here, then you get a very small gap of 0.4 Kelvin, if any. So basically the T1 in this material is not gapped, or if there's a gap, it's very, very small compared to the value I was giving for prediction for a short-range RVB model, for instance. I remember it was, I recall it was J over 20, J over 10, something like that. Okay. So let's go back to the theory now. So after this initial study of the trimerized lattice, there have been more studies, and especially in the limit that is more realistic for this material, for a finite value of J1 over J2. So the first trial was in the team of Yongbaek Kim. They tried with a variational Monte Carlo method, and they say that they found for the lowest energy a gapped Z2 spin liquid. Now with the same method, Yassir Iqbal and Didier Poil-Blanc a bit later on found, well, they extend the variational set of function, and they found a lower energy for a U1 Dirac spin liquid, so gapless state, that seems to be realized down to fairly low value for the ratio of J1 over J2. And then Cécile Replin made some other approach with DMRG and exact diagonalization, and they find also spin liquid, gapless spin liquid, with, interestingly, they found that there are signatures, Dirac cones signatures, just like in the DMRG for the pure Kagome model. So it seems somehow that there is a continuity from the breathing model up to the Kagome model, the isotropic Kagome model. There is no qualitative change in the nature of the spin liquid state that is realized. So this is true down to very low ratio for J1 over J2. There seems to be interesting physics below with maybe nematic phases and well, interesting physics that were reported, I think, also by Didier Poilblanc. But okay, this is not relevant for this material. Okay, so to conclude on this case, so this vanadiate material is the first, to my knowledge, the first realization of a breathing Kagome model or trimerized Kagome model with a finite value for the ratio of the interaction. We found experimentally that the material is gapless, or if there's a gap, it's very, very tiny. So theoretical model, either from DMRG or variational method, show that the ground state is indeed likely gapless and quite similar to the isotropic case. What we don't understand or master so far is the effect of the coupling between the vanadium 3+ and vanadium 4+. This J3, there are good arguments to think that it's small, but it's certainly finite. And below temperature of this, similar to this J3, there's probably some effect on the ground state. We don't have a pure, simple layer of vanadium 4+ anymore. So that's an interesting problem. I don't know if it can raise some interest for theoretical studies. And I would like to stress that this family of oxyfluoride material, actually, I'm not specialist, but it's a very specific chemistry to stabilize this oxidation state of vanadium. And really, they had in mind in St. Andrew to design material, not to reproduce existing mineral as we often do in the field, but they really think in advance of what kind of material they would like to make to realize a frustrated family. And actually, with this kind of method, you can design several different structures. They made, for instance, a single layer of spin 1 Kagome, vanadium 3+ Kagome, separated by organic molecules. They make mixture of vanadium 4+, vanadium 3+, different than the one I've shown. And it's not impossible to push this reflection to get a pure vanadium 4+ material, which would be obviously very interesting.
Are there any nitroscattering experiments?
No, because there is a lot of hydrogen. It's not easy to deteriorate, and the samples are fragile, very fragile actually. It's very hard to grow single crystal. They are nice. In the powder, you see very nice pellet, hexagonal, small crystals, but they are very small. Very 2D, very hexagonal, very nice, green shape. But they never manage to make something. The chemistry is a bit hard on this one. Should I skip the second topic? Maybe? You want me to take 5 minutes to say something? 5 minutes? Okay, we'll try that. Okay, so second topic is about, let me simply introduce the lattice. So the hyper-Kagome lattice was discussed for this material, which is a iridate material, back in 2007, I think, and also for some garnets. So the idea is that you have a kind of pyrochlore lattice, so corner-sharing tetrahedrons, and on this lattice you suppress one site out of 4 in an ordered manner, so that in the end you've got triangles, the black ones here, which are corner-sharing, and they form a 3-dimensional structure. That is the so-called hyper-Kagome lattice. So this material was studied a lot, including by us. It's very interesting, but a bit complicated, especially because of iridium 4+ ion. So it's a very rich physics of the iridium with strong spin orbit, and there is a lot. Well, it's very interesting, but a little bit complicated as a model system. So this material that we've been studying more recently is nice because we are back to our usual copper, which is Heisenberg spin 1/2 as a good realization of Heisenberg spin 1/2, and it's somewhat easier. So in the structure of this lead copper tellurium oxide, so the copper are the only magnetic ions. They have spin 1/2, and so the complication is that there are a few relevant interactions. So this has been found by DFT calculation. So you have the first main interaction, which is making the red triangles there, which is actually the hyper-Kagome of the copper ions. So that's likely that should be the dominant interaction. But then you have additional interaction. You have one between that make additional coordinates in this lattice, if you want, and that make the blue triangles, links for the blue triangles there, which is smaller but not negligible compared to this one. And there is a third one that is also not negligible, which make chains, the green chains here. You see here on top. So it's actually the network is actually quite complicated. It's a network of a three-dimensional network of copper 2+ with a rather strong connectivity or coordinates of z equal 8. It depends a bit how you count. And it doesn't seem to be the best case to look for a quantum spin liquid because the coordinates is large. But it turns out that there is no freezing in the material, and there's signature and neutron scattering for a continuum of spin-on excitation. So I can just mention that there is a more recent neutron scattering study by the team of Bella Lake in this paper that is not published so far, but will be soon, I guess. They made over DFT calculation and refined the interaction. They found something slightly different. Well, the same interaction are relevant, but with slightly different values. They found that the blue and the red interaction are very similar, more similar than in this paper. So they call actually this lattice a hyper-Kagome lattice. But still, you've got the three interaction are relevant. Let me skip that. So with MuSR, we found that there is no freezing in the material, no long-range order, no spin glass. There are interesting things which I skip. This is the NMR, NMR of lead, which is quite nice because it basically confirms the MuSR and the persistence of slow fluctuation at low temperature. Namely, what we found is that this is the NMR intensity. The NMR intensity is the number of nuclei, so it should be constant, except sometimes close to a transition if you have strong relaxation effects, which are related to critical fluctuation at the approach of a transition. So here it seems we have something similar. Close to 1K, we lose the signal, but what is very original is that we never find the signal back, actually. It may, if there was a transition around 1K, you expect that you lose the signal here, but you should get it back here when everything is static again. And here we don't. So it's a negative view of the MuSR, showing that even here, very far from the 1K energy scale, 1 order of magnitude below, you still have slow fluctuation, in your system that makes strong relaxation in NMR, and, which make the signal disappear. So it's quite nice. So it's not a very good news for NMR because it means you cannot work basically below 1 Kelvin. The energy scale here is about 20 Kelvin, 22 Kelvin, the average value of the interaction. And this is the susceptibility. The susceptibility is very different from what I've been showing or what is known in Herbert-Smithite or in Barrel-White. Actually, the susceptibility is monotonic. It's very similar, the local susceptibility, that's the blue dots here, and the squid susceptibility are very similar. They, so the system is very homogeneous. And you see that basically, so theta is around here, the exchange energy, and the susceptibility levels off at low temperature to some susceptibility, to some temperature-independent susceptibility, which may remind Pauli-like susceptibility, so what you would expect again for free spinon. So that's very similar to what was found in the yeah. Well, just like in a metal, basically. Pretty naive, but that's somehow what was proposed for the iridium case, which was maybe more complicated. So it's very different from the Kagome case we know. And maybe in the end I can just show you that. So that's the inelastic neutron scattering on the material, which so this is Poder inelastic neutron scattering. Like us, they found that there is no gap down to no gap larger than 0.15 millieV. So no gap larger than 1.5 Kelvin, and they found a broad continuum of excitation here around 0.8 angstrom inverse, and this is data on single crystal. So this is data and this is computation, and they basically, with the value of the interaction I was showing before, they reproduce the main feature of this broad continuum, namely the fact that you have like a double maximum here in this branch. So we have a new three-dimensional structure material. It's quite clean. From USR and MR, we know that the material is the spins are still fluctuating at very low temperature. We have a susceptibility that is quite different from the simple Kagome case. It's monotonic and saturates at low temperature. And there is a continuum of spin-on excitation from the neutrons. So it's what we can call a good candidate for spin liquid material from the experimental point of view. Also, so it's a very nice material because it's very pure. You can make single crystal. So what we are trying to do, which is very interesting from NMR, is to put in the material vacancies like zinc copper substitution, but this now on purpose, starting from a very homogeneous situation. In a controlled manner, you put some vacancies, and what we want to look at is the spin texture around this control effect in the material. Okay, and with that, it was a bit more than 5 minutes. I don't know if you want to comment, Cécile, on I was maybe a bit harsh on the theory. I don't know. I was not too harsh on the conclusion of your paper and
No,
Didier Poel-Blanc and so on.
I think they don't find the same state actually. So the fact that this Kagome spin liquid seems to survive even with really high values of the anisotropy, I think that's very consistent across all numerical studies.
Yeah.
And then the conclusion starts to differ if we go to very anisotropic models where we all see a transition but to something different. And well, in my case, I can also say that the value of the transition is it's really hard to extrapolate because it seems to vary a lot with finite size. But it varies in the right direction, so to speak, in the sense that as the size increases, this J1 over J2 parameter at the transition becomes smaller and smaller. So it seems quite robust that this is the same phase as the regular Kagome has a very phase. But then, yeah, it's more speculative what happens for very anisotropic.
Okay.
It appears to me that your unit cell contains two triangles and the spin one.
Yeah.
And the whole thing makes a spin how many? 3, 4.
Yeah.
So it can be a singlet. So how about just, I mean, do we really need sophisticated models? Cannot be just a product wave function of this
yeah, but it would be nice. I guess that if J3 would be larger, that would be nice. But basically, that's not what happens. For instance, the susceptibility at low temperature, it shoots up. For instance, so that's not at all what you would expect if the whole thing was going to singlet.
I mean, the gap that you are looking at is very, very tiny, and the J3 is very, very tiny. So you are still far from constant.
If you go, you mean if you would go at low temperature compared to J3, what would happen? Okay. You would expect that at some point when everything couples, you may form a singlet state at the end. You should try to go lower in temperature.
And you have like a
single triangle that's
and you have
there are another triangle on top. Yeah, it's two. Yeah. Yeah, maybe we are not low enough. Maybe J3 is even smaller than we think, and we are not low enough to see that. So it's possible. Yeah. We are still in the decouple limit, temperature higher than J3.
I forgot, did you give an order of magnitude for J3 or?
No, it's difficult because it's too small for DFT. It's really in the limit where it's difficult to distinguish ferromagnetic, antiferro, and so on. What we have is a very indirect measurement of the effective coupling between the vanadium 3+. Okay, for instance, if you feed the low temperature tail, it's not Curie, it's Curie Weiss with a small theta. So this is an effective interaction of the order of 1K, quite as usual, I would say, between the vanadium 3+. But the physics behind this effective theta can be very complicated. There is G3, but there is also, it goes through the Kagome plane, and so I don't know how it relates exactly to G3.
Can the 3+ vanadiums be polarized?
Yeah, you can, exactly. We played that game when we were studying fluorine for NMR, for example, to get rid of their contribution. You can try to increase the fit and polarize them. You see this in magnetization. Magnetization, you have a Perrin-1 function for the vanadium 3+, and on top of that, a linear term.
They also give an order of magnitude.
Yeah, but there again, you've got a theta of the order of 1K, but there again, it's I would say it's an effective interaction of I don't know. It's not directly J3.
J for the second?
It's about 20 Kelvin. The average of you've got these three interactions.
No chance to enter monetization plateaus and all that field-induced conditions.
Well, in the copper oxide, well, it would be accessible. If there is some plateau, you see J. All the J are, so the theta is about 20 Kelvin, all the J are antiferromagnetic. There's no cancellation effect or so on. So all the J are below 20 Kelvin, something like that. So no, it's not so far, 20 Tesla. I guess we measure magnetization, maybe not that high, but that's something we could try actually. Yeah. It's not been measured, magnetization at high field yet.